a conservative commentator known for her unflinching willingness to challenge progressive narratives, someone who's built an entire career on refusing to accept arguments simply because they're delivered with confidence, encounters what she considers the most intellectually dishonest panel in daytime television. When someone who spent years dismantling weak reasoning through systematic logic faces hosts who've operated in an echo chamber so complete that their arguments have never been seriously tested. When a debate about one of America's most divisive issues becomes a masterclass in exposing contradictions so glaring that even their most loyal viewers might start asking uncomfortable questions, what you're about to witness is not just another political debate where both sides shout talking points past each other, not just another partisan shouting match where volume substitutes for substance, not just another culture war skirmish where everyone leaves more convinced of their original positions. This is the moment Candace Owens systematically dismantled The View's abortion arguments with surgical precision, exposing what she saw as fundamental contradictions in their reasoning that had gone unchallenged for years, pointing out logical inconsistencies that should have been obvious but had been ignored, because acknowledging them would be politically inconvenient, and demonstrating the difference between arguments that sound good and arguments that actually make sense. This is Whoopi Goldberg and Behar discovering that not every commentator will nod politely while their talking points go unchallenged, that not every conservative will simply accept being called a religious zealot without responding with facts and data, that not every voice in the abortion debate will allow itself to be dismissed with emotional appeals that fall apart under the slightest scrutiny. This is what happens when someone finally demands that arguments actually be coherent rather than just emotionally satisfying to their audience. Candace Owens didn't walk into The View studio that day. This was a counterpoint segment where she responded to clips from the show, but she approached their arguments with the same intensity she would have brought to a live confrontation. She knew exactly what to expect from these hosts. A panel who'd spent years promoting abortion rights without serious intellectual challenge from their own side, who'd built their positions on emotional appeals rather than rigorous logic, because their audience rewarded feelings over reasoning, who'd grown so comfortable in an echo chamber, where agreement was assumed and dissent was dismissed, that they'd stopped even trying to make their arguments internally consistent. What they got instead, what their audience got instead, was someone willing to pick apart every argument piece by piece, expose every contradiction with receipts and evidence, and refuse to let bad reasoning go unchallenged, simply because it came wrapped in righteous indignation and delivered with the confidence that comes from years of never being seriously contradicted. This isn't about whether you're pro-choice or pro-life. This is about intellectual honesty, logical consistency, and what happens when someone finally says, "Your arguments don't make sense, and I'm going to explain exactly why, using your own words, your own contradictions, and your own logical inconsistencies." Behar thought she could make sweeping statements about sex, culture, and responsibility without being challenged on the assumptions behind them, without anyone pointing out that her diagnosis of the problem actually revealed more about progressive culture than conservative values. Whoopi Goldberg thought she could invoke biological reality when it was convenient for abortion arguments, while simultaneously denying that same biological reality when it came to transgender activism, never expecting anyone to point out that you can't have it both ways without being a complete hypocrite. They both discovered that Candace Owens plays a different game, entirely one where emotional appeals don't substitute for logic, where contradictions get exposed rather than ignored, where feeling righteous about your position doesn't excuse you from making it actually make sense, and where the comfort of an echo chamber doesn't protect you from someone willing to hold your arguments up to the light and show exactly where they fall apart. Buckle up, because what unfolds isn't just a political debate. It's a lesson in how to challenge conventional wisdom that's been repeated so often. It's achieved the status of unquestionable truth, how to expose weak arguments that have survived only because they've never faced serious scrutiny, and how to refuse to let bad logic pass unchallenged, just because it's delivered with confidence, moral certainty, and the applause of an audience that's been trained to cheer rather than think. The View studio had hummed with its familiar self-righteous energy that morning, when Joy Behar and Whoopi Goldberg recorded the segment that would later become the target of Candace Owens' systematic dismantling. The Supreme Court abortion case had given them fresh material, new reasons to express their practiced outrage, additional opportunities to position themselves as defenders of women's rights against what they consistently characterized as ignorant religious extremism that somehow didn't understand basic biology. Joy Behar had opened the segment with the comfortable confidence of someone who believed she was speaking obvious truth to an audience programmed to agree with everything she said. Her voice carried that particular tone, part condescension, part exasperation, that she reserved for topics where she believed the correct position was so obvious that disagreement could only stem from ignorance or malice. "It's a very interesting schism that goes on here," Joy began, settling into what was clearly a prepared speech rather than spontaneous observation. "On the one hand, sex sells everywhere. I mean, you can't see an aspirin commercial without somebody having sex. You cannot turn on any program, especially on streaming, where people are having their soft porn everywhere now." She paused dramatically, letting her audience appreciate the setup before delivering what she clearly believed was a devastating observation about conservative hypocrisy. They encourage all of that. It sells everything. Sex sells. And yet when it comes to the reality of pregnancy, this particular group of people on the right in this country, these religious zealots, do not understand the reality of what happens when you have sex. The audience murmured their agreement right on cue, nodding along with this narrative they'd heard countless times before, that conservatives were somehow ignorant of basic human biology, that religious people lived in some kind of denial about sexual reality, that the right's position on abortion stemmed fundamentally from not understanding how pregnancy actually happens. It was a comfortable narrative, one that let Joy's audience feel intellectually superior while avoiding engagement with the actual arguments conservatives made. The other hosts nodded along supportively, creating that echo chamber effect where agreement gets mistaken for truth and repetition gets mistaken for proof. Nobody challenged Joy's framing. Nobody asked whether her characterization of conservative positions was accurate or fair. Nobody pointed out the massive assumptions embedded in her seemingly simple observation. This was The View, operating exactly as designed, a space where progressive positions got reinforced through repetition rather than tested through rigorous examination. But Candace Owens, preparing her counterpoint segment later, watched this clip with the focused intensity of a surgeon, identifying exactly where to make her incisions. She saw not a devastating critique of conservative ignorance, but an argument so fundamentally flawed, so full of unexamined assumptions, so reliant on mischaracterizing the opposing position, that it practically begged for systematic dismantling. "Welcome back for today's counterpoint segment," Candace began, that her voice carrying none of Joy's self-satisfied certainty, but instead the focused intensity of someone preparing to dissect an argument piece by piece, exposing each logical flaw with the precision of someone who'd spent years doing exactly this. "I wanted to discuss the recent Supreme Court abortion case. Honestly, this isn't even about whether you're pro-choice or pro-life. I just do not like bad arguments. And the arguments coming from the left right now are absolutely bonkers." She pulled up the clip of Joy's opening statement, letting it play in full so her audience could hear exactly what she was responding to. This wasn't about taking things out of context or strawmanning positions. Candace was going to use The View hosts' own words, in their full context, to demonstrate exactly where their logic failed. "So let's start with absolutely bonkers, Joy Behar," Candace said. And the way she said bonkers suggested this was going to be thorough, methodical, and utterly unsparing. The clip played. Joy talking about sex selling everything, about aspirin commercials and streaming programs, about soft porn everywhere, building to her conclusion that religious zealots on the right somehow didn't understand what happens when you have sex. Candace let the clip finish, then leaned forward with the expression of someone about to explain something very carefully to someone very confused. Counterpoint number 1. I want to say yes, Joy Behar. You are correct. Sex is everywhere. Our culture is sick. That's a diagnosis. We have an increasingly sick culture here in America. The brilliance of this opening was immediate and obvious. Joy had presented the sexualization of culture as simply an observed fact. Maybe even something she was critiquing, but certainly not something she held any responsibility for. Candace reframed it instantly as a diagnosis of cultural sickness, and importantly, a sickness that progressive culture had created and promoted. Religious zealots and people on the right very much understand that reality, Candace continued, her voice taking on an edge that suggested she was just getting started. We understand that when a culture promotes promiscuity, it leads to people engaging in unfulfilling, unprotected sex. Far from your assessment that we don't understand what happens when you have sex, we understand exactly what happens. Children are the consequence. Life is the consequence. This was the first major inversion of Joy's framing. Joy had suggested conservatives were ignorant of sexual reality, that they somehow didn't understand that sex leads to pregnancy. Candace responded by suggesting it was actually progressives who didn't understand, or more accurately, who understood perfectly well, but chose to pretend that the natural consequences of sex were somehow surprising or unfair when they occurred. It would seem to me, Candace continued, building her counter-argument with careful layering, that it's the atheist zealots, the ones who have normalized sex-laden aspirin commercials, who don't quite understand what happens when you have unprotected sex. And then when they find out, they go, whoops, well, good thing I learned in health class that I can just get an abortion to deal with it. The characterization was devastating because it took Joy's accusation of ignorance and threw it back with evidence. Conservatives weren't the ones surprised by pregnancy. They were the ones saying all along that sex produces children and should be treated with appropriate seriousness. Progressives were the ones promoting consequence-free sex, and then acting shocked when consequences occurred, treating pregnancy like an unexpected side effect rather than the obvious biological outcome of sexual activity. But Candace wasn't satisfied with philosophical arguments alone. She understood that dismantling the View's positions required more than just rhetoric. It required facts, data, historical context that challenged the narrative Joy had presented as obvious truth. "Did you know, Joy?" Candace said, and the way she said it made clear this was about to be a fact that complicated everything Joy had just argued, that before federally funded sex education programs in schools, which sprang up in the 1970s, and before Roe v. Wade in 1973, teenage pregnancy rates in this country were declining over a period of 12 years. The statistic landed like a bomb in the middle of comfortable assumptions that had never been seriously examined. The entire progressive narrative about sex education and abortion access had always rested on the premise that these interventions were necessary to address teenage pregnancy, that without comprehensive sex ed and abortion access, pregnancy rates would skyrocket because teenagers were having sex anyway, and needed these tools to manage the consequences. But if pregnancy rates were actually declining before these interventions, if the problem was getting better on its own before the progressive solutions were implemented, what did that say about the effectiveness or necessity of those solutions? What did it say about a culture that had replaced declining pregnancy rates with rising ones, while simultaneously insisting that its approach was the only realistic one? Candace didn't just throw out the statistic and move on. She understood that data without interpretation was just numbers. She needed to explain what this fact meant for Joy's argument, needed to show how it completely undermined the foundation of what The View had been claiming. "Maybe what we on the right understand," Candace continued, her voice carrying absolute certainty in her assessment, "is that there is such a thing as sexually transmitted insanity, the normalization of non-committal sex, which is pervasive in our culture and in our schools, and it serves no one, least of all the young women who wind up pregnant, and are pressured to make a life-altering emotional decision that is packaged to them as the responsible thing to do. This reframing was perhaps the most devastating part of her counterpoint. What progressives called reproductive freedom and responsible choice, Candace was reframing as pressure on young women to make decisions they might not want to make, decisions that were being sold to them as responsibility, when they might actually represent an escape from responsibility that would haunt them later. The progressive narrative had always positioned abortion as empowering women with choice. Candace was suggesting it actually disempowered them by creating cultural pressure to choose abortion, by making it seem like the only responsible option when faced with an unexpected pregnancy, by treating carrying a child to term as the irresponsible choice rather than simply one of the available choices. I believe that you and the ladies that sit beside you contribute daily to that toxic culture of lies, Candace concluded, her voice leaving absolutely no doubt about where she believed the responsibility lay for the sexual culture Joy had described. The argument represented a complete inversion of The View's typical framing. They positioned themselves as defenders of women's autonomy against religious control and patriarchal oppression. Candace positioned them as contributors to a culture that actually harmed women, that normalized sexual behavior without commitment, that treated pregnancy like a disease rather than a natural consequence, that pressured young women into life-altering decisions and packaged that pressure as empowerment. But Candace wasn't done. She'd systematically dismantled Joy's argument, exposing its faulty assumptions and providing data that contradicted its premises. Now it was time to take on Whoopi Goldberg, and the contradictions she was about to expose were even more devastating, not just because they revealed flawed logic, but because they revealed the kind of selective application of principle that characterizes intellectual dishonesty at its most blatant. Whoopi's clip played, and her voice rose with that particular indignation she reserved for moments when she believed she was delivering an unanswerable argument. Do any of you men have any eggs or the possibility of carrying a fetus? How dare you talk about what a fetus wants? You have no idea. The audience in the studio had applauded enthusiastically when Whoopi delivered this line. It sounded powerful, felt righteous, had that quality of seeming to settle the debate through pure moral force. It was a familiar argument in abortion discourse. Men shouldn't have opinions on abortion because they can't get pregnant, and it had been repeated so often in progressive circles that it had achieved the status of obvious truth, something that didn't need to be examined or defended, because everyone already agreed it was correct. But Candace saw something different. She saw not an unanswerable argument, but a trap so obvious, a contradiction so glaring, that exposing it would be almost too easy. The only question was whether Whoopi's audience would recognize what had just happened when Candace held up the mirror. "Well," Candace began, and there was barely contained amusement in her voice, the tone of someone who's about to enjoy themselves immensely. "I'd love to see the same energy when it comes to biological men dressing up as women and claiming they can get pregnant because they're trans women. Something tells me Whoopi wouldn't be singing the same tune in that conversation." The observation was devastating in its simplicity, surgical in its precision. Whoopi had just made a biology-based argument that only people with actual female reproductive systems, with eggs and wombs and the physical capacity for pregnancy, could speak meaningfully about pregnancy and fetal development. But The View had spent years, literally years, promoting exactly the opposite position when it came to transgender issues. They'd argued that biology didn't determine who was or wasn't a woman. They'd insisted that anyone who identified as a woman was a woman, regardless of biological reality. They'd called people transphobic for suggesting that pregnancy required female biology. They'd promoted the idea that trans women could get pregnant, could breastfeed, or chest feed as they'd learned to say, could do everything biological women could do, because gender was purely a matter of identity rather than biology. And now here was Whoopi, in the middle of defending abortion rights, accidentally making the exact argument that The View would call transphobic bigotry in any other context, that biology matters, that only people with female reproductive systems can get pregnant, that physical reality determines who can speak with authority on pregnancy. But Candace didn't just point out the contradiction verbally. She brought receipts, actual, documented evidence that Whoopi herself had promoted the exact opposite position when it was convenient for a different progressive cause. "Did you guys know, by the way," Candace said, pulling up the documentation she'd prepared, "that in 2017, Whoopi Goldberg received a GLAAD Media Award for executively producing a show called Strut? It was a transgender modeling show. She won the award for speaking up for trans rights and against those trying to roll them back. She let that information sink in for a moment, then delivered the kill shot with perfect timing. Oopsies. This is why I love intersectionality. Here we are in the middle of a vicious culture war where a bunch of men playing dress-up are trying to convince people that they are women and can give birth and can chest feed. And here comes along Whoopi Goldberg, so fired up about abortion that she accidentally tells the truth: only women can give birth. Only women have a womb capable of carrying a child. The contradiction was now stark, undeniable, documented with Whoopi's own history. When defending abortion rights, she invoked biological reality. Only women can get pregnant. Only women have wombs. Only women should speak on this issue because only women experience it physically. But when promoting transgender activism and accepting awards for it, she promoted the exact opposite position: that biological reality didn't matter, that anyone who identified as a woman was a woman regardless of physical characteristics, that suggesting pregnancy required female biology was hateful bigotry. "They say never get in the way of your enemies when they are making a mistake," Candace observed, clearly enjoying the irony. "They also say even a broken clock is right twice a day." I say thanks, Whoopi, for proving that even idiots are capable of understanding basic biology, at least when it's convenient for their argument. The rhetorical demolition was surgical, but it also revealed something deeper and more disturbing than simple logical inconsistency. This wasn't just Whoopi making a mistake or failing to think through her position carefully. This was selective application of principle depending on which progressive cause was being defended at any given moment. When transgender activism required denying biological reality, The View denied it without hesitation. When abortion rights required invoking biological reality, they invoked it without acknowledging any contradiction. The principle whether biology matters or doesn't matter changed based on political convenience rather than actual conviction. This kind of selective application of principle is what Candace was really exposing. It's one thing to hold a controversial position consistently. It's another thing entirely to invoke a principle when it supports your argument and abandon that same principle when it doesn't, all while pretending you're being consistent and your opponents are being unreasonable. Candace wasn't just pointing out that Whoopi was wrong about abortion. She was pointing out that Whoopi didn't even believe her own arguments, that she'd use biology when it was convenient and deny biology when it wasn't, that she'd accept awards for promoting ideas that directly contradicted the arguments she was now making, and that this kind of intellectual dishonesty was par for the course on The View. The systematic demolition of The View's arguments wasn't finished yet. Candace had exposed Joy's faulty premises about who understands sexual reality. She'd revealed Whoopi's blatant contradiction on whether biology matters. Now she was going to tackle the broader argument about abortion and responsibility in a way that would force uncomfortable examination of assumptions that progressives had never seriously questioned. "For the last counterpoint," Candace said, her voice taking on a more serious tone that suggested this was where everything came together, "which I believe is so important in terms of this abortion debate. We currently have a culture where men are routinely accused of not stepping up to the plate. In fact, just this week it was announced that only 18% of households in America today feature a nuclear family unit, a married mother and father, raising children together." She paused to let that devastating statistic register. 82% of American households were not intact nuclear families. The breakdown of the traditional family structure wasn't just happening, it had already happened, was already the dominant reality of American life. Make no mistake, Candace continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd thought deeply about this issue. Father absence is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, epidemic that we face in this country today. It's connected to nearly every social pathology we're trying to address. Poverty, crime, educational failure, substance abuse. Father absence is the common thread running through most of our social problems. This was setting up for something bigger than just discussing abortion. Candace was connecting abortion arguments to broader questions about family structure, male responsibility, and the cultural messages we send about fatherhood and commitment. But why are we expecting men to step up to the plate, Candace asked, her voice taking on an edge of challenge, when we have women telling them that they don't have to? Why should men step up when the message ringing out loud and clear from mainstream culture and media is that beyond sex, men have no responsibility or say in the lives of their children? The argument was subtle but devastating. If my body, my choice means fathers have zero input into whether their children are born, if women have complete autonomy over the pregnancy, with no obligation to even inform the father, let alone consider his wishes, then why would men feel obligated to take responsibility for children that result from pregnancies where they had no voice? I mean, how on earth can someone logically explain, Candace asked, pushing the logic to its uncomfortable conclusion, how a baby is 100% the property of a woman as it grows inside of her, then the moment that baby is born it requires a 50-50 split? She let that contradiction hang in the air for a moment, then made it even more explicit. Can a man stand before a judge at a child support hearing and say, "Your Honor, it was her body and therefore her choice to have this child"? The answer, of course, is no. Obviously not. That would be stupid. The parallel was now completely clear, the contradiction impossible to ignore. During pregnancy, progressive logic said fathers had zero rights, zero say, zero involvement in the decision. The pregnancy was entirely the woman's domain, her body, and therefore entirely her choice. But the moment the child was born, suddenly fathers had 50% responsibility, financial, legal, moral. They could be sued for child support, prosecuted for abandonment, socially condemned as deadbeat dads if they failed to support children from pregnancies they'd had no say in. If a man is colloquially referred to as a deadbeat dad, Candace said, driving the point home with unmistakable force, for taking no part or responsibility in a child's life as he or she grows up, then the same must also be true for a woman who wants no part or responsibility in a child's life as it grows inside of her. Her final line landed with the force of a verdict, a judgment rendered after careful consideration of all the evidence. My body, my choice is a pervasive deadbeat mom argument that accomplishes nothing but excusing too many men from stepping up to their most important role as fathers. This final counterpoint might have been the most devastating of all, because it connected the abortion debate to issues that even progressive audiences cared about deeply. Everyone was concerned about father absence. Everyone agreed that men should take responsibility for their children. Everyone condemned deadbeat dads who abandoned their families. But Candace was pointing out that my body, my choice, the rallying cry of abortion rights activism, actually contributed to this problem by sending a clear cultural message that fathers don't matter, that male input on pregnancy is not just unnecessary but actually illegitimate, that women should make these decisions entirely on their own without considering the father's wishes or interests. If fathers don't matter during pregnancy, why should they matter after birth? If their desires about whether to have children are irrelevant, and even considering them is seen as infringing on female autonomy, why should they feel obligated to support children that result from decisions they had no part in making? The logic was uncomfortable but unavoidable. You can't tell men they have no rights during pregnancy, and then demand they accept full responsibility after birth. You can't say fatherhood is optional during the 9 months of pregnancy, and then mandatory for the next 18 years. You can't celebrate female autonomy in choosing whether to carry a pregnancy to term, and then condemn male autonomy in choosing whether to support the resulting child. Either fathers matter, or they don't. Either they're equal partners in the decision to create and raise children, or they're not. But the answer can't change depending on whether you're talking about abortion rights or child support obligations. That's not principle, that's convenience. Changing the rules based on which answer serves your interests in any given situation. Candace's counterpoints had now systematically dismantled every major argument The View had made. Joy's claim that conservatives didn't understand sexual reality had been inverted to show it was progressives who promoted consequence-free sex and then acted surprised by consequences. Whoopi's biology-based argument against male voices in abortion debate had been revealed as contradicting her own promotion of transgender activism that denied biological reality. The broader my body, my choice framework had been exposed as contributing to father absence, while simultaneously demanding male responsibility, a contradiction that served female interests but undermined family stability. What made these counterpoints so effective wasn't just that Candace disagreed with The View's positions. Plenty of people disagreed. What made them effective was how she systematically exposed the logical flaws, internal contradictions, and unexamined assumptions behind arguments that had been repeated so often they'd achieved the status of unquestioned truth in progressive circles. She'd shown that Joy's argument rested on mischaracterizing conservative positions and ignoring data that contradicted the narrative. She'd shown that Whoopi's argument required selectively applying biological reality only when convenient. She'd shown that the abortion rights framework contributed to the very social problems progressives claimed to care about solving. Most importantly, she'd demonstrated what real engagement with opposing arguments looks like, not dismissing them based on moral superiority or tribal affiliation, but actually examining the logic, testing the consistency, exposing the contradictions, and showing exactly where and why the reasoning fails. The View had spent years making these arguments in an echo chamber, where nobody challenged them, where audiences applauded emotional appeals without demanding logical coherence, where contradictions went unexamined, because pointing them out would be politically inconvenient. Candace Owens represented what happens when those arguments finally face serious scrutiny, when someone demands they actually make sense rather than just feel righteous, when contradictions get exposed rather than ignored, when bad logic doesn't get a pass simply because it's delivered with confidence and moral certainty. Whether you agreed with her conclusions or not, her methodology demonstrated something important. Arguments should be able to withstand scrutiny. If they can't, if they only work in echo chambers where nobody challenges them, if they require selective application of principles depending on convenience, if they fall apart, when someone actually examines the logic, then maybe they're not as strong as their proponents believe.